The midterms happened last night and are happening as we speak. And the biggest takeaway is that the Republican Party had a very bad night. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't still possibly have a majority in the House. They're actually still favored to do so, or even have a fighting chance at the Senate. But they did not at all have the red wave that everyone expected. If you've been keeping up with the pundit world, with the polling, you would have thought last night was going to be a horrible, horrible night for the Democratic Party, and that just did not bear out. And that is exciting news. So we're going to get into all of it. The first big takeaway that was exciting is election deniers did very poorly. So let's get into that. But first, I want to let you know where it stands now. Both the House and Senate are up for grabs. Either party could be in the majority in those two chambers, and just a few races are going to determine it. And we'll look at which races are going to in a second. But first, election deniers did poorly last night, and that is a win for democracy. Doug Mastriano, the bonkers gubernatorial candidate, of course, claiming there's a whole election stealing going on and nonsense. Tudor Dixon, Christina Caramo, Tim Michaels, and possibly Lauren Boebert could lose her race as well. The first that I listed have been projected to lose. Lauren Boebert is yet to be called, but is not looking great for her, which is good news. So what this means, and what you're seeing in the pundit world, even among right-wing networks, is a question, more so a conclusion, about the fact that Trumpism, the election denial that we're seeing based on his lies, is not a good look, is not a good political stance for the Republican Party going forward. Because when you are in a situation where the president of the party that is had taken over, and then oftentimes the political winds go in the opposite direction, right? So the president's party does poorly in the following midterms historically, and that president is not particularly popular in the polling, and there's something hurting people economically like inflation, and there's rising crime, or there has been over the last few years, that sets up a perfect situation for the opposition party to do really well. And they didn't. And that's crazy. So let's break this up into two things. Senate, House, what does it look like? Senate is going to come down to 3 states, and it's close in all of them. Arizona, Georgia, Nevada. As you guys know, these are crucial races for the individuals running in them. So let's take a look at where the polling, or I should say where the vote count is at this point in time. Arizona, you have Mark Kelly versus Blake Masters. Mark Kelly is a Democrat, Blake Masters is a Republican. Blake Masters is a very dangerous candidate. Kelly has a good advantage. It is 51.4% to 46.4% as of now, but only 72% of the vote is in. So we'll see as those votes get counted. Every vote needs to, of course, be heard. And then the Georgia race, right now, Warnock is holding a very narrow lead, and Walker is trailing just barely. You have 49.2% to 48.7%, but because of the way, as we'll look at in a second here, that Georgia functions, their election process, that is going to have to go to a runoff, and we'll get into the details of that later. Nevada, you have Laxalt versus Cortez Masto, who is the incumbent Democrat. And right now, Laxalt is also leading 49.9%, but also a very thin margin. 47.2% is where Cortez Masto sits. So as you can see, these are all close races. Kelly has a pretty significant advantage, but much less of the vote is in that race. So where do I feel good about? Where do I feel bad? I think Arizona is going to be okay. I think Kelly can pull it through. Georgia is going to a runoff, and we'll see how Warnock, in the build-up, the 1 month between now and that runoff, what can be done on that front. And then Nevada, we're just going to have to see. Right now, it looks good for the Republican candidate, but Cortez Masto has a shot. We're going to look at something that outlines that in a second. But what you would have to do, what the Democratic Party would have to see happen for them to gain the majority, is to grab 2 of these, right? So if today they were able to get Arizona, Nevada before the Georgia runoff, boom, they have that 50 vote threshold with Kamala Harris breaking the tie, and they are now still in the majority, and then they could add one more in the Georgia runoff. If Nevada goes to Laxalt and Arizona goes to Kelly, now you have, like we saw in 2020, everything comes down to Georgia with the majority in the Senate. That is wild. So, as I mentioned, Georgia's going to a runoff. Here's the Secretary of State of Georgia announcing that.
There is one race in our state that is going to be moving to the December 6th runoff. That is the race for the United States Senate between Senator Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker. Our office has already begun the behind-scenes work to start building the ballots. So ballots are being built as we speak, and counties are making preparations.
Okay, so that will happen. It's going to be intense either way it goes. But that, we're just going to have to wait a month. Let's try not to simmer in the fact that Herschel Walker was able to get that large of a percentage of the vote, even though I think we have hope for what could happen in December. We could also completely fall into despair thinking about Herschel Walker causing a runoff to happen by getting that percentage of the vote. But as far as Nevada goes, one of the 3 states that will determine who has the majority in the Senate, and we're waiting on as we speak, here's a little bit of analysis from MSNBC that gives hope to Cortez Masto possibly being able to close that gap between her and Laxalt.
What we don't know is how many mail ballots remain to be counted in Clark County, which all of you know is 70% of the vote, and it's where the Democrats always do well, and they especially do well in mail ballots. And so if there are enough mail ballots there, and some people think, this is coming from both sides, and if you look at the turnout, it's probably true that there may be as many as 100,000 mail ballots to be counted. The Democrats generally have won the mail ballots in Clark by about 2-1. So it's not over yet here in Nevada, but I know what the next question is, so let me help you guys out. When will we know? And the answer to that question
anchor yourself right through this segment, Mr. Ralston. Thank you.
Okay, so this is interesting because the situation you have oftentimes whenever this many votes have been counted and one individual has a lead like that is a little bit of, okay, Laxalt's probably going to win. But as he highlighted, the remaining vote, which is key when breaking down these races, is left in heavily Democratic areas and mail-in voting, which, as the political reality is now, does skew Democratic. And so that actually could, with those remaining votes, push Cortez Masto into a very close lead. We'll see. And like I said, if that were to happen, if Mark Kelly was able to hold on to his lead in Arizona, you could have this week, instead of having to wait till December, an answer on who controls the Senate, which would definitely give me a little relief. And then as far as the House goes, it's just going to come down to a handful of races. There's still 50 when we're recording this, outstanding races that haven't been called that will determine the balance of the House. You can see the breakdown from CNN here. How many have been called for Democrats? 187. How many have been called for Republicans? 204. You got to have 218 to control the House. And of the competitive seats, Republicans need to have 11 of them won to gain control of the House. So we're just waiting on those races. You can go dive into the specifics of them if you're interested, but the point is we just have to wait on that to see where the House falls. It's more likely, based on where the results sit now, that Republicans will take over the House. But if some of these races where the Republican is leading right now in the count swing the Democrats' direction, you could have a situation where they hold on, which would be completely bonkers and quite exciting. Last moment I want to show you here, Fox and Friends just trying to kind of process and respond to this in real time. The fact that Republicans are just not getting that red wave they expected.
And so progressive. People are just dug in. They're dug in really deep right now. And
John Fetterman you're talking about?
Absolutely. He is so extreme, wants to open up a third of the prisons.
Doesn't frack?
Yeah, exactly, and lied about it. How about Mandela Barnes? I mean, he wants to open 50% of the prisons.
Right. He's trailing.
And he's running against Ron Johnson, but it's still tight. But how do you explain this country now, Brian, to your point? I mean, we have open borders, record gas prices, inflation is the worst in 40 years.
Okay, so many statements there. Wow.
The president's approval ratings are so bad, worst crime since the 1980s, and yet I heard last night this is an indictment on the Republican Party. Is it? I mean, how are these issues, when our country is in such a bad state right now, how is this not a red wave?
Well,
And so
just can't understand it. How on earth did it not go their way? I can't understand it. Well, part of it is their analysis that they've been feeding their followers of the state of America isn't actually accurate. Inflation is hurting people. That is real. But when you understand, besides inflation, all the other economic indicators are actually now shifting in a really good direction, especially because we're not that far from a very bad economic downturn. We saw record job growth, super low unemployment, back to record lows there. GDP is back in a growth direction. So maybe people are feeling the fact that they understand inflation's bad. They also understand where that may have come from, the economic downturn that the pandemic caused, and the fact that it's worldwide. So obviously it can't just be the Democratic Party, and see that maybe we're headed back in the right direction, even though we're not where we need to be economically. And then they do, while crime is an issue, mischaracterize it deeply, and the border, we don't have an open border. Okay. Here's last thing for this segment. I think I said last thing on the last one. This is actually the last thing. Kevin McCarthy preemptively saying that they're going to take back the House. But that's not actually true yet. It could well happen, but he pretended like it's absolutely sure.
It is clear that we are going to take the House back. In New York, we defeated the Democrat campaign chairman, Sean Patrick.
Okay, you get the point. So that was last night, well before. Even now, as we're sitting here, we don't know if the House will necessarily be taken over by Republicans. Great night, even though it's still scary that the Republican Party, in this point in time in American history, could get that amount of the vote. But understanding the context, the historical trends and patterns, pretty good night, and I think you can take a little bit of a deep breath.